We have arrived, as you know, at the middle of the church age. All right, so we're literally in the middle of the age of the church, and we are now moving our way over the last two lessons, the lesson from 2 weeks ago and tonight, across that boundary into the second half of the church age. If you count the church age from about 30 AD to about 2021, the middle part is right about 1000 AD, which is where we're at. Last time we were together, we talked about the great schism between the East and the West, which occurred in 1054, in which the church in the East said no to the Bishop of Rome. No, we don't want to be under your authority. No, we don't want to telling us what to do. And that great schism divided the church into two very clear divisions that exist even to today. For the past 1,000 years, the East and the West have been two distinct churches. The church in the East, of course, is the church centered at Constantinople, the Byzantine church, which will continue from that point all the way to today, although the Byzantine Empire itself will continue only into the 1400s, but the church continues even to today. Our look at church history then, from this point forward, is going to be myopically focused on the West, not on the East. There's really nothing to talk about on the eastern side of the church for the next 1,000 years. The church is basically, on the East, is basically just going to continue doing what she does, and I would argue drifting slowly away from orthodoxy to where it is today. In a sense, the modern Eastern Orthodox Church has become sort of a liturgical, sacramental, and sacerdotal system. Very much like Catholicism, except with all of the other dogmas that have been added to it. So I would argue that on the Eastern side, that doctrines of justification by faith alone have been lost just as much as they were on the West. But there were no reformers to stand up on the Eastern side and raise up a new Reformation there. It's just continued on the way it is. Now, I will admit that the Eastern Church has been more faithful to the original orthodoxy established at Nicaea and Constantinople than Catholicism has on the Western side. I would certainly agree with that. But I cannot say with any definitive oomph that a typical Eastern Orthodox worshiper is biblically literate or has a deep and abiding understanding of the doctrines of grace. Really don't see that on that side of the house. So we're going to leave the Eastern side of the church now and move myopically to the West, okay? And as we turn to the West, we're talking about the church centered in Rome under the Bishop of Rome, otherwise known as the Pope, okay? And at this particular time, right about 1000 to about 1300 or so AD, the Roman Church, the Western Church, has reached its zenith of power, politically, socially, culturally. This is a time which I've referred to as the golden age of the medieval church, the golden age of the Western Church, because we have the church in the West, centered at Rome, covering Europe, wields tremendous power at this point. The popes are men of enormous power. We talked about a couple of weeks ago the reality that these men got to their posts very often by killing their predecessors. That's what kind of power is being wielded here. So we're talking about a church that has massive wealth, massive influence, massive power. Even emperors at this point are under the authority of popes, and we'll talk about some of that even a bit tonight. So we're at the zenith of Western power. But if you're at the zenith, where are you going from here? You're going downhill, okay? And where we come to tonight in the second half of this lesson, which I call the golden age of the medieval church, is we're going to talk about tonight some of the things that set in motion, eventually, what will come to be known as the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Reformation. All right, we're going to be looking at some things that are going to start to get the ball rolling of a whole new way of thinking in the Western Empire, the Western side of the church, okay? From now on, I'm going to just stop calling it the Western Church. I'm just going to call it the Church, okay? So just be aware that I'm talking about the Western Church, leaving the Eastern Church aside, which, by the way, is where most Americans think of the church anyways. They're not even aware that there's an Eastern side of the church, most Westerners anyways. The monastic reforms that we talked about in the previous lesson and the Crusades that we talked about have left the church in Europe looking for a center, okay, looking for a center in the sense of something around which it can define itself. And the church, having reached its zenith, we begin to see a time of fresh thinking start to appear, okay? And I want to introduce you tonight to a couple of things, and mostly we're going to talk about individuals tonight, in this time frame, and the way that they're going to begin exposing, if you will, some new ways of thinking. And if you're paying attention, you will notice as we talk about these things how they will feed into the thinking of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and even the Reformation to come, okay? So keep that in the back of your mind as you're listening to what we're talking about. The first thing I want to introduce you to is something called the mendicant orders. Now, the mendicant orders were based on this idea of people deciding to take a vow of poverty and live with no earthly means. Mendicant itself means those who live by begging or those who live in poverty, okay? Now, the church herself, the initial reaction of the church to people like this was to despise them. And the part of the reason why is because the church had become so very powerful and wealthy. The assumption, of course, is, well, look, if we are Christianity and we are wealthy because God has blessed us, and that therefore to be a Christian implies you should be wealthy and powerful and so forth. That kind of thinking has now invaded the church world. So what you are going to see in the mendicant orders is some people who are going to step back and say, well, wait. Spirituality's been lost in all this equation. You'll notice I said the church has reached her apex of political power, social power, cultural power, but not her apex of spiritual power, okay? That is missing. So what you're going to see is you're going to see some individuals who are going to step up and say, wait a minute, let's rethink how we understand church life. In many ways, this flows out of the monastic movement. You remember at the very beginning, when the church became the imperial church, what did people do? Look, we need to get away from the institutionalized social contract church and go live someplace alone, and we'll build our own little communities, and we'll have our own little spiritual life. We'll get away from all this official Christendom. You see the same kind of thinking going on here. People looking at the church, seeing its wealth and its social power and its decadence, and thus saying, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way here. There's got to be a better way to serve Christ. The precursors to the mendicants were the Waldensians, followers of a man by the name of Peter Waldo, who lived in the early 12th century. He had devoted himself to a life of poverty and gained a number of followers, but he was forbidden by the Pope from practicing his beliefs. His form of religion was rejected by Rome for the reasons I gave you just a moment ago, and he was persecuted by the church. In fact, he was driven into the valley in the Alps, where he built a small following and remained there. The Waldensians remained in the Alps, living out their life of poverty, scratching out an existence of poverty, under a Christian flag, until the days of the Reformation. In fact, some of the reformers actually went and spoke and adopted some of the thinking of the Waldensians in the Alps. But probably the most famous mendicant in all of church history is a man by the name of Francis of Assisi, or Assisi, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Francis was born somewhere around 1181, lived until 1226. He was Italian. He lived in Italy, but his mother was French. His father had trade relations with France, which allowed him to travel to France frequently. Francis was fond of the French troubadours, particularly their songs. And so he became known by the nickname Francesco, which is another way of saying singing of the French troubadours. He had some sort of religious experience that led him to embrace a life of poverty. He thought of himself like Peter Waldo. He rejected earthly wealth, including his father's. He rejected his father's inheritance. In fact, his father tried to lock him up at one point because he thought he was gone mad. And he had said, "I'm not accepting your inheritance." In fact, at one point, when his father had him jailed, Francis, when his father finally said, "Okay, I'm going to let you go," Francis took off all the clothes that he had because it belonged to his father, gave it to his father, and left naked from his father's house because it was, "I don't own a thing, and I don't want any of your stuff, even the clothes off your back." He eventually gave everything up to live as a hermit. In 1209, however, he heard a sermon preached on Matthew chapter 10, verses 7 to 10, where Jesus, you remember, sends out his disciples to go out and preach during his ministry, and he told them, go out with nothing, okay? Don't go out with anything. And Francis took that as the idea, or got from that the idea of taking his vow of poverty and his life of deep poverty and spirituality to a different level, which was to actually go out and preach as a poor man, as a beggar, in the cities, and lead others into a life of deep spirituality. So he discovered this idea of preaching to the poor in the cities while taking care of their needs, and he gained a small following in doing so. Later, he appealed to Pope Innocent III to start a monastic order, and the Pope granted him this, even though previous popes had said this was an unacceptable form of Christianity. But Innocent III, we're going to come back to him in a minute, he was more wiser, I guess, than the men who preceded him. And so he allowed for this, but he wanted to test Francis's mettle. Are you really the type who wants to give up your life? And he told him to go wallow in the mud. And so Francis went and found himself a pigsty and wallowed in the mud and came back covered with mud. And the Pope said, must be serious. Okay, I'll let you start a monastic order, which he did.
Was he naked still?
No, I think he had clothes on at this point. He led that order until 1220, just 6 years before his death. The order itself, ironically, eventually shed its order of poverty and gained great land holdings after Francis's death. You will notice that all things eventually go back to the way that they were. So one particular individual in this particular way of thinking was this man by the name of Francis of Assisi, but there was another order of poverty-based monks who lived in Spain, and they were what are called the Dominicans. They began under St. Dominic, somewhere around 1200. Again, designed to both live in poverty for the purpose of discipline and to study doctrine. Or more specifically, to call forth orthodoxy amongst the masses. The idea of these two men was to shed earthly things in order to focus on spiritual matters. If we can eliminate possessions and things to worry about, we could focus our attention on spirituality. And so these orders, the orders of Francis, the orders of St. Dominic, were designed in this particular way. Now you will notice that's a thinking change, all right? It's a sea change of thinking that's going to find its way through the church for the next few hundred years. And it's going to become important as we move towards the future developments that will come in the life of the church. We're also, as I said, at the apex of the papacy as well as the apex of the church. Innocent III, I mentioned him a moment ago. He's the one that sent Assisi to the pigsty. He was Pope from 1198 to 1216, elected to the papacy during the time of the Crusades and the great political upheaval that was occurring in Europe. Pope Innocent III wielded tremendous political power over Europe. In Germany, he actually installed young Frederick as emperor. In France, he intervened in the marital affairs of the king. The king had divorced his wife, married another woman, The Pope had condemned him, put him under interdictment, in fact, put the entire country under interdictum. The king, realizing he wasn't going to win this battle, divorced the third wife, went back to the second wife, and the Pope relieved him of the interdictum. That's tremendous power. In England, he appointed Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, over the protests of one John Lackland, who believed that he should be the Archbishop of Canterbury. You will notice that in three particular areas where you have political power that's great already at this point, France, Spain, Germany, France, and England, you see the Pope intervening in the life of the emperor to actually make the emperor do what the Pope wants, and succeeds, and does so by using his power as a Pope, specifically to say to the king, you either do what I tell you to do, or you are condemned to hell. That's a tremendous power. And kings listened to these men. He played a role in the Mendicant Orders, as I mentioned a moment ago. He allowed for the Mendicant Orders to be established. He was involved in the Crusades. He was involved in that little short Latin Empire we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and the Reconquista that occurred in Spain, the Crusades that occurred in Spain. He was involved in all of those things. But he was probably best known for something called the Fourth Lateran Council, which he called in 1215. This literally took 3 days to accomplish. It did a number of things. There's a whole list of things that the bishops did, but it's obvious, based on the fact that it only took 3 days for all this to happen, that it was Innocent's push and his desires and designs for it. First, it established as dogma in the Catholic Church the concept of transubstantiation. It is at the Fourth Lateran Council that the Catholic Church believes and now teaches and has taught that in the Mass, the bread and wine become the literal body and blood of Christ on the altar. Okay? So that is dogmatized in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. He also instituted a form of episcopal inquisition. Bishops in local parishes were now required to inquire into heresy in their diocese and make corrections, sometimes by excommunication if necessary. Third, it ordered every cathedral, now this is a key one, I want you to think about this one, hold this on, He required every cathedral in the church, in the empire, to have a school, and that school was to be open to the poor. All right, keep that in mind. Fourthly, it required clergy to abstain from various cultural pastimes, theater, games, hunting, football. I don't think football is invented yet, but okay, those sorts of things were no longer considered acceptable. Priests were to focus their attention primarily on spiritual and political and social matters, not on pastimes and entertainments. This was a form of reform, but it didn't last. And then finally, amongst many other things I could list, it required confession and communion to be taken at least once a year. This would be the beginning, by the way, of the dogmatized idea that the Catholic Mass is a day of obligation, as well as several other feasts are days of obligation. This would be the codification of that idea, into the life of the Church. And so you see it going back to Fourth Lateran Council. So the Fourth Lateran Council becomes, in many ways, the principal architect, as a council, of many of the heterodoxies that are going to become a part of Roman Catholicism from this point forward, or part of the Western Church, okay, part of the church that we're studying, all right? So this council becomes, if you will, the forerunner. You will notice that it takes 3 days for these things to happen. This is Innocent's idea. So Innocent III is the guy who's not so innocent in all of this. That was a pun. See that? You catch that? He's not so innocent here. He's the guy who is responsible for a great deal of the downward slide now of the Catholic Church from its orthodoxy, as best as you could describe it at this point, into these various clearly non-biblical dogmas that are going to come. It's going to begin at this point. There are a number of successive popes of the Golden Age. The first Dominican pope was Innocent V in 1276. The first Franciscan pope was Nicholas IV, 1288 to 1292. But in terms of the real power of the papacy, in terms of the real power of the popes, it reached its zenith, its pinnacle, under a guy by the name of Boniface VIII. Boniface VIII ruled from 1294 to 1303. He wrote a bull, which is otherwise known as a paper to be distributed, called Unum Sanctum. And he made the declaration in that bull that political authority, temporal authority, all temporal authority on earth, is always under spiritual authority in the world. Or more specifically, all authority is under him. All authority is under the Pope. Okay. So you'll see just 300 years after the great schism that occurs between the East and the West, where the East told the West to take a hike when it came to the Bishop of Rome being in charge of the church, at 300 years later, the church in Rome is declaring itself to be the authority over the earth, period. And that all other authorities, temporal authorities like kings and emperors and prelates and all the other things that might come along, they are all subject and their authority to the Pope. The Pope is making his statement that this is us. And it goes one step further. Not only does this bull declare that all temporal authority belongs to the Pope, or more specifically to the the church, all right? It also declares that there is no salvation outside of the church. There's no salvation outside of the Roman pontiff. Specifically, the language is, quote, "For salvation, all human creatures be under the Roman pontiff," unquote. That has never been rescinded by Roman Catholicism. Okay, that statement has always been in effect. Modern popes dance around it. And I noticed that John Paul II danced around it a lot. I noticed that Benedict danced around it a lot. Francis ain't even coming close to touching it. But here's the bottom line. As far as Roman Catholicism is concerned, unless you are a Catholic, you cannot be saved. You, as a Protestant, non-Catholic believer, cannot be saved. You must be under the authority of the Roman pontiff. Now, you will notice the reason I put this here, okay? Where's this going to put us? This is going to put us into the language that you see written, for example, in the 1689 Confession, where you will see the Westminster Confession and the 1689 Confession both call the Pope the Antichrist, because they will argue that he is asserting his authority as the spiritual authority over all things, including the Scriptures itself, putting himself higher even than the Bible in terms of authority. And the result of that, of course, is the Reformers came by and said, no. That is not only unbiblical, it's anti-biblical. That's why you get that language in the confessions that you do in the 1600s, because you have that sense in the church, you must be under us. Now, you will notice that this is the kind of things that are going to be ushering in some new ways of thinking. Okay? Okay, you'll see where we're going here. We're going to get eventually to the Reformation. We're going to get to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. But these are the kind of things that are laying the groundwork for it. There'd be no reason for a Reformation, frankly, if such a bull had never been published. For there would have been the possibility of Luther being able to reform his church back to the solas of the faith. But the church denied that reality by virtue of such statements, you see. And thus, some were forced to break away. Which leads us then to the third element that I want to talk about here in this age, and that's the rise of something called scholasticism. Okay? Scholasticism appears during this time as a system of theology and philosophy based on Aristotelian, I always have to stop and pronounce that word, Aristotelian logic, and the early church fathers having a strong emphasis on tradition and dogma. All right, let me say that again. It's a system of theology and philosophy. It's a new way of thinking based on Aristotle's view of the world over against Plato's view of the world, because up until now, most of the church has been governed primarily by a Platonic view of the world. Okay? It's a new time, now get this, it's a new time of rational thinking paired with religious faith. It's a time of answering the question, is there logic to the Christian religion? Up until now, faith and reason have been categorized into two separate spheres. Now, you and I find this very hard to believe because we live in a post-Enlightenment world, okay? We live in a world in which science and reason and logic are at the very core of what we are because we're post-Enlightenment children. We can't imagine a world, frankly, in which the average churchgoer thinks of things of God, not in rational, logical, observable ways, but simply in terms of, it's been said, therefore I believe it. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to try to prove it. I don't need an apologetic or a commentary. It just is. It's very hard for us to get because we are such children of the Enlightenment. It's very hard for us to unthink that way, okay? Once you turn that light bulb on, you can't turn it off. This is when it begins. Scholasticism begins to arise in this time. Now, it's more of an asset to the Golden Age. Although it's more of an asset to the Golden Age, the rise of new theological activity would aid in ushering in the Renaissance and the Reformation, and the very collapse of the Golden Age itself. This age is going to end because of this new way of thinking coming into place. The new scholasticism begins in the monasteries. That makes sense, doesn't it? That would be the logical place. That's where the thinkers are. That's where the writers are. That's where the monks are spending time considering theology and so forth. The new scholasticism would arise in the monasteries, but by the 12th century, it had moved into cathedral schools. You remember those schools I talked about a little while ago that Innocent said that the Fourth Lateran Council had to be at every cathedral, remember, and it had to be open to the poor? Well, guess what? Those schools now become centers of learning. Not just training in spiritual things, but actual places of learning. And the result is this scholasticism then moves into these places. By the 13th century, by the time you get into the 1200s, it moves into the universities. So it goes from rural areas to urban churches to gatherings of scholars in major cities. You see the invention of the university beginning at this point. Now, there are two developments that are significant for the rise of scholasticism in Western Europe. First, as I said a minute ago, the rise and growth of universities. Rigorous academic exercise and specialization becomes a key to this new way of thinking about faith. In fact, theology becomes a specialty. In fact, theology becomes the queen of the specialties. In many ways, theology becomes the queen of the sciences in the sense that everything functions through the lens of theology. So it becomes a specialty in the universities. And then secondly, the second thing that leads to the rise of scholasticism is the reintroduction of the teachings of Aristotle. Okay. Now, as I said a minute ago, up to this point, the church was largely Platonic in its approach to theology. And what I mean by that is the concept of the real is abstract, existing outside of the range of the senses. Platonic thinking is there is something real, but you don't know what it is. You've never seen it, you've never heard it, it's out there. What's real in the Christian church? God. Christ is real. Have you ever seen him? Have you ever touched him? Ever had a conversation with him where he's actually talked back to you in a physical sense? No. There's a sense in which, in Platonic thinking, the real, which is God and everything about God, and everything about the gospel and spirituality is out there. It's real, but you don't have access. So you believe it by faith. You live as a Christian as though there is a God, there is a Christ, I believe in him, but I don't really have anything more than that. Again, it's very hard for you to think platonically because you're an Aristotelian just by virtue of being a post-Enlightenment child. Okay? Aristotelian philosophy, however, valued the senses as a part of the process leading to true knowledge. The ability to see and hear were essential in determining truth. The independence of reason from the constraints of faith and theology were introduced. In other words, okay, there is a God. How do I prove it? Now you will notice that this is the very earliest seeds of what would eventually come in the days of the Enlightenment. And the scientific method, which would come from the Enlightenment, of course, flows right out of this way of thinking. So it's beginning here. We're seeing this new rise of scholasticism coming through this period of time. Okay? Platonists would argue that, you just believe it, you just have faith, and that's what's necessary to achieve correct understanding. All right? Now, let's talk about some of the folks who are the forerunners to this medieval scholasticism, and then we'll talk about the great scholastic. First forerunner was a man by the name of Peter Abelard. He lived from 1079 to 1142. He wrote a book called Yes and No. And in this book, he took up 158 theological questions. The 158 theological questions were designed to show that various authorities, like the Bible and ancient Christian writers, were often at odds on the answers to these questions. He dared actually question the dogma of certain things in the sense that he said, how do we really know that X is true or Y is true or Z is true? Now, obviously, the book was greatly opposed, and Abelard was accused of heresy by the church of his day because it was such a strange way of viewing the faith. But Abelard's purpose was not to discredit the authorities or to discredit the Bible, but rather to show that theology must not be content with just citing authorities. You can't just say, I believe this because the Pope said it. Or I believe this because somebody said it, or the Bible said it, or whatever. A thinking man would ask deeper questions to understand this. The goal was to reconcile such authorities. The method that was adopted in all of scholasticism was to try to pose a question, quote authorities on both sides, and then find a solution to prove a position. The goal was not, as you might think here, the goal was not to discredit the faith, but in fact quite the opposite. To say, listen, we take this stuff blindly, but we don't have to take it blindly. There are proofs to these things. There are reasons and logic behind why we believe these things. Probably the greatest example in our day, of course, that we understand is this. The very simple objective reality. One simple objective reality. Either Christ walked out of that tomb on that Sunday morning or he did not. Correct? And all of us in this room would utterly agree that if he did not walk out of that tomb, then the Christian faith is dead. That there is no Christian faith. It didn't happen. In that day, that would not even have been a question. That would not even have been an issue. The resurrection was simply because we told you so. The idea of actually going and thinking it through and going, okay, what if Christ didn't walk out of that tomb? That was not even asked. But what the scholastics began to do is began to think through some of these deeper things. Here's what I would argue. The flow of history to me looks something like this. You have the original church fathers who began trying to understand the original writings of the apostles, right? Remember, we talked about them back in the early church. We talked about those early guys like Irenaeus and Origen and those guys, Tertullian. We're trying to figure out what it was the apostles were saying. And they had all kinds of ideas of their own. Many of them were wrong. Some of them were right. We don't use the church fathers as much of an authority anymore because the fact is they were only at the beginning of the process. But you see the church going through the motions then and beginning to ask questions. Okay, is the Son fully equivalent to the Father? All right, so we call a council at Nicaea. We address that issue, yes. We debate that, yes. Okay, then we ask the question, is Christ fully man and fully God, or only part one? We call a council at Constantinople. We answer that question definitively. Okay. From that point, then, the church just sort of drifts along, if you will, sort of assuming the answers to the questions. In fact, not even assuming the questions itself at all. Just sort of, well, this is the faith, once delivered to the saints. We believe that the creedal statements, and that's it. So there's not really much thought going into it. There's not really much what's the word I'm looking for? There's not really much scientific engagement, okay? Now, again, you would have a very hard time putting yourself in that world because we don't live in that world, okay? But they did. And the necessary result of that then is this. Men start thinking through the questions. What does this mean? And they start asking questions. Second man was a man by the name of Peter Lombard, not to be confused with Peter Abelard, the guy I just said. He lived from 1096 to 1164. He wrote a book called 4 Books of Sentences. It was an early systematic theology on the main themes of Christians. So it was one of the very first systematic theologies ever written. If you ever looked at a systematic theology, say, go get Grudem's or go get Berkhoff's or go get MacArthur's, or there's many of them out there. When you're reading a commentary, what you're getting is, you're getting a logical, scientific examination of all of theology packed into a book. Well, that's what he did. How do I take all of that and turn it into something more manageable in the sense of something I can reason through? Well, his book actually became the basic textbook for teaching theology in the universities. Lombard also, by virtue of his studies, determined that there were 7 sacraments. So at this particular point, notice again, we're at the apex of the church here, that the church decides at this point, and this became dogma, this became established Roman dogma from this point forward, that there were 7 sacraments or means of grace in the church. Baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, anointing of the sick, holy orders, and matrimony. Only 6 of which you could participate in. Because you can't do both holy orders and matrimony. You're either ordained a priest or you get married. You can only do 6 of them, okay? I always thought that's interesting because for me it's like, wait a minute, you're cheating me out of one. The third man, the third forerunner here is a man by the name of Anselm. Anselm of Canterbury, lived from 1033 to 1109. He wrote a book called the Proslogion. He established in it the idea of applying reason to faith, not to prove something he didn't believe, but to understand more what he already believed. Okay, that's the idea here. Anselm developed something which is called the ontological argument for the existence of God. Okay, you're familiar with that word ontological, right? Because I use it all the time. The ontological argument for the existence of God. Okay, follow this logic. Number 1. To think of God is to think of that of which no greater can be conceived. Okay, can you imagine the greatest being? And the answer is, yes, you can. Right? You can imagine a being greater than you, and you can imagine a being greater than that one, and one greater than that, and one greater than that, all the way up to the infinitely highest being. Okay. To think of God only in the mind, point number 2 then, to think of God only in the mind is to allow for something greater. Or, which is greater? The being that exists or the being that doesn't exist? The being that exists is the greater being, right? So if you could think of an infinite being, then you must imagine that that being exists, or you haven't thought of the highest being possible. Because the highest being possible is the being that not only is highest, but also exists. Therefore, since humans can conceive of a greatest possible being, that being must exist in reality. Otherwise, we have not thought of the greatest possible being. His argument is very simple. If you can imagine that there is a God, then you must imagine that he exists, because if you don't, then he's not the greatest possible being, because you can imagine the greatest possible being, and so therefore God must exist. Try that in your philosophy class sometime. Now, this is never really a compelling or complete argument for the existence of God. There's always been a picture of assumption in all of this, of course, from the biblical perspective. But what you will notice is that Anselm is developing the idea of applying reason to faith. Why do I believe there is a God? Why do I believe the next dogma and the next dogma and the next dogma? Is it simply because we've been told it's true? Or is it because it's reasonably logical to assume that it's true and it can be deduced rationally and reasonably? This is scholasticism in a nutshell. The main medieval scholastic, the scholastic of scholastics, is a guy by the name of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas lived from 1224 to 1274. Okay, you'll see where we're at. In the middle of the 13th century. Aquinas was born in Naples to an aristocratic family. At 5, he was placed in the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino to begin his education. At 14, he moved to the University of Naples. He was young and smart. In 1244, at the age of 20, he became a Dominican. His family disapproved and locked him up in the family castle, trying to dissuade him. He escaped and went to study at Cologne. But, like so many extremely intelligent people, like me, his fellow students called him the dumb ox, failing to see it. Because sometimes really smart people seem really dumb, don't they? Because their personalities are such that they're off-putting, they don't know how to communicate with others very well, they don't have very good social skills, etc. So Aquinas earned the nickname of dumb ox because he was so smart. You would say something to him, he would look at you with this look on his face like he didn't understand what you were saying. But in fact, what he was doing was contemplating in his mind how to answer that, and he was 40 steps ahead of you already with his answer. He spent most of his life in academia, particularly in Paris. He wrote 2 great works that we still have. The first is called Summa Contra Gentiles. This was a manual on theology for missionaries to Muslims. It's the first great apologetic written to dealing with Muslims in terms of Christianity. The second, however, is by far and away his greatest work, and some would argue possibly short of Augustine's works, probably the greatest work ever written. And it's called Summa Theologica. It was an instructional guide for moderate theologians. It was 3,500 pages in length. It was a compendium of all the main theological teachings of the church at the time. In fact, it is the Summa Theologica that is the basis for why Thomas Aquinas is called the father of the Roman Catholic Church. The father of the Roman Catholic Church. Not in the sense that he birthed it, but in the sense that he's the guy that theologians after him went back to for their answers to questions related to the faith, this particular work. In this compendium, there was a cycle of material, the way it worked. If you read through it, and I wouldn't even challenge you to try, he starts with the existence of God. He works through creation, man's purpose, Christ, the sacraments, which brings him back to God. Because the sacraments bring you to God, right? So it's a cycle. And so every theological concept through the work is brought in that cycle. Man, or God, man, creation, etc., all the way through the cycle. So it was in the midst of it, he has something which he calls the 5 ways. Out of the 3,500 pages, it's a page and a half. It's called the 5 ways, and it's the 5 ways of proving the existence of God. In a page and a half, Aquinas came up with 5 arguments similar to the ontological argument that I shared with you a minute ago. And they're really very simple. They're so simple that they don't need any embellishment on the paper. The first is something called the unmoved mover. Okay? Anything that's moving requires a mover. Because by definition, the only way to get it moving is for someone to move it. Since the world is filled with movement, there must be a mover. So who's the mover? In other words, who started Jupiter in its orbit around the sun? A mover did. Who is he? Second, it's the first cause argument. Some things are caused. Something uncaused has to start the causing. If something exists, it has been caused. Therefore, something had to cause it. But that thing, whatever it is, has to been caused, which means that whoever created that had to be caused, and so forth, back to something that's not caused. It has to go back eventually to the point where you say there's an uncaused thing that causes everything else to be. That's a perfectly logical argument, isn't it? There's the argument from contingency. Only something that exists can create that which exists. Therefore, there can be no self-existing thing except the first thing that exists. And that would, of course, be God. Everything else exists as a function of existing. And so, therefore, there must be someone who makes all things exist. There has to be, if you go back far, again, notice that all these arguments are what we call infinite regression arguments. Okay? If you go back far enough, you're eventually going to have to find something that starts the process. The universe simply cannot exist without having something started that exists. Number 4, the argument from degree. There are degrees of perfection, correct? There are degrees of perfection. Therefore, there must be something perfect. If there are degrees of perfection, there must be something perfect, by definition. Because, again, an infinite regression would be, okay, this is pretty close to perfect, and this is a little closer, and this is a little closer, and eventually you're going to get to perfect. The fifth one, however, is the one that is the most famous from Aquinas, and it's called the teleological argument. It's a little different from the ontological argument. The teleological argument is that all natural things in the world have an end or purpose, right? Everything has a purpose. Nothing can establish its own purpose. Nothing can establish its own purpose. It must exist for a purpose. Therefore, there must be a being that establishes purpose. The teleological argument is sometimes called the watchmaker argument. If you're walking down, let's say you land on a planet that no other human has been on before, and you're walking down the beach on that planet, and you stumble in the sand and you find a watch in the sand, and you pick up the watch and you begin to examine it, and you look at the watch and you realize, what do you realize? That this watch could not possibly have been made by natural processes. Therefore, the object must have a purpose because it was formed by something not natural. In other words, it didn't occur by random accident. Therefore, it must have a purpose. Your goal or purpose, then, is to figure out what its purpose is. What is this object? You know, imagine a caveman landing on planet Earth and wandering down the beach and finding a watch. And he picks it up. He's never seen a watch before, but he knows it's not a naturally occurring object. It must have been formed by something, and he turns it over, looks at it, and goes, what is this thing for? And after observation, he'll probably figure out, well, this thing tells time, or counts time, or defines time, or something to that effect. See? The teleological argument is the idea that everything has a purpose, and nothing can have a purpose on its own. Therefore, there must be a purposer beyond all things. So you will notice that what you see happening here, you see the Middle Ages, although ruled by this anti-intellectual. I don't really like that term. It's not really the best term to describe it, but it's the best one I could come up with. This anti-intellectual idea that you believe in Christ and you believe in God because you've been told that's what's true. You either accept it as fact or you don't. Okay? But now you see men starting to stand up and go, wait a minute, let's stop and think about this. And the particular thing that the scholastics did is they said, and this was one of Aquinas' perspectives, is our world is orderly. The world we live in is orderly. It has logic in it. If God is the creator and logic is the result, then we should be able to apply logic to the faith. Because if God invented logic, then logic must have something to do with his intentions and purposes in the world. So you start to see men now standing up and saying, let's think about this, okay? So while Anselm began with the concept in the mind and moved to an external conclusion, okay? Remember, Anselm's argument was, think of God, right? Okay, can you think of a greater being? Yes. Can you think of an even greater being? Yes. Can you think of the ultimate being? Of course. Does that being exist? Well, he must, otherwise he's not the greatest of the beings. So you'll notice that Anselm began in the mind. Okay, so he says, let's think about things from in the mind, and therefore we can conclude certain realities. Aquinas flips it on its head. Aquinas flips upside down. What Aquinas does is says, let's start with things in the world and move to internal conclusions. Right? I pick up a watch and I look at it. It's an object in the world. I see it. I turn it over, I examine it, I begin to make assumptions about it. I listen to it, it's ticking, right? It's external, but now it begins to make conclusions where? In the mind. So Aquinas is really the first, along with many others, of course, in his day, but he's the greatest, of men who start to say, wait a minute, the Christian faith is logical. Because we have stuff outside of the mind that can help us to understand the truthfulness of what it is that we believe. Our beliefs don't have to be just blind faith. And we've argued, of course, and you've probably heard pastors say this all the time, we don't have, as Christians, a blind faith. We have a reasonable, objective, verifiable faith. I gave you the resurrection as Exhibit A, right? But we have many other Exhibit A's that would go along with that. This is what you see starting at this time. Now, the strange thing about this is going to be the genesis of the Reformation, which we preceded, of course, by the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. But it's also going to be the downfall of the Western Church from its apex of power. It's going to be the thinking through of these things that are actually going to cause the popes to lose their power. Why? Because up until now, the primary statement that the church would make is, you believe it because I said it's true. Now, a man sitting at the other end says, well, you might say it's true, but I want to see some evidence of it. I want some proof of it. I want to look around in the world that God has created and have more than just your word for it. And we will see then, of course, the ushering in of whole new realms of Christian reality, such as textual criticism when it comes to Scripture. How do we understand the books of the Bible that we have are, in fact, coming to us faithfully? We will see translation of Bible into languages familiar to the people. You see? You see where we're at here, right? If we're in the middle of the 13th century, we're only 2 centuries from the beginning of the Reformation. And so the Enlightenment and the Renaissance are going to fly from this point, because now you're going to have men standing up and saying, listen, it's not just about me taking your word for it. Now it's about me using all of this gift of intelligence that God has given to us to examine the physical world that He has created and put purpose and order in it, and go and find true and real assurance of our faith. And by the way, this has been flipped on its head in our day, right? Today, everyone starts from the skeptical perspective. Okay, I'm not going to believe it unless I can prove it. In those days, it was the opposite. The scholastics were, I believe it already, and so I'm going to go and prove what I believe to be true. You'll notice how that's flipped on its head today. Today, it's the scientific method says you don't believe anything until it's absolutely proven to be true. So we can't even start with God. Okay, there's no starting with God in this equation because we can't prove God, and so we got to throw him out of the equation. We just got to start with raw observation. But that's not what the scholastics were doing. The scholastics were saying, wait a minute, we're starting with there is a God. We're starting there is a Christ. We're starting with salvation by faith, and we're moving into the world of logic and reason to show that those things are true and real. And that's why I said theology became the queen of the sciences in those days, because everything was through the lens of theology. You started with the fact that there was a creator. You started with the 5 ways, right? There is a God, and everybody knows it, because all the evidence is there to prove it. So this is why I wanted to show you why this is the golden age of the medieval church. This is the period of time in which the church grows to the apex of her power politically and socially and culturally, but it begins to lose its grip on that in the process of faithful men now stepping out and questioning the unquestioned dogma. And there will become a real tension in all of this, which will open the door to the Reformation. Okay? Any questions that I can answer? Anything that I said along the way that you need some help on?
Where do you see that flip happening from people starting with faith and working to prove or to logic
Yep.
faith versus the
When did that flip occur between, theology over logic versus logic over theology? The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, when you get into the scientific era, when the scientific method becomes primary. Yeah. And that's, again, the church is losing her grip on faith, because now as you move towards rationalism, you go from blind faith to rationalism to scientific model only, okay? The middle ground is good ground to live in, but you know how human beings are. They can't hold balance. And so in the attempt to come out of blind faith to a rational, logical, real way of understanding the faith, they swing the pendulum way too far and undercut themselves in the process. And then, of course, the world is full of atheists who run in to help push that along.